Welcome to Sci-Fi Quantum Archives. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and explore. They were never meant to be found. Buried beneath the silt of centuries, pressed into silence by wind and war, the stones stood unmoved. For millennia, they held their line, thick pillars of carved basalt and limestone, arranged with such unnerving precision that it felt less like construction and more like inscription. Not a temple, not a tomb, not a shrine to gods or kings. A message. Archaeologists walked among them, cataloging motifs, photographing glyphs, speculating on rituals. They spoke of animal totems, fertility rites, solar alignment. But none of them asked why a people with no metal tools, no written language, and no known system of measurement could mark a circle with perfect radial symmetry across uneven terrain. No margin of error, no deviation, as if the land itself had been persuaded to cooperate. It wasn't noticed at first. The spacing between columns, the angle of the foundation, the height ratios, just numbers written in dust, overlooked by generations chasing stories instead of patterns, until one researcher, working alone, without funding or peer review, ran the layout through a mapping program meant for satellite calibration, and stopped. He ran it again. The measurements formed a ratio, not just any ratio, a convergence constant only formalized in the 18th century, a mathematical artifact with no utility in daily life, no architectural function, no artistic appeal. An equation that only exists in the abstract, and yet, here, frozen in stone, in a structure dated 12,000 years before calculus was ever conceived. His hands trembled as he checked for coincidence. Random number generation, scaling anomalies, statistical drift. But the numbers held. Tightly bound. Purposeful. Intentional. He contacted colleagues. No response. He drafted a paper. Rejected for lacking cultural context. The institutions dismissed it as pareidolia. Pattern-seeking madness. Coincidence weaponized by imagination. But he knew. Because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The ratios begin to appear in other places. Temple steps in Mexico. Obelisk shadows in Nubia. A disused stone well in rural Turkey, whose depth aligns perfectly with a derivative curve not discovered until Newton. You begin to ask questions you were trained never to ask. Who encoded this? Why in geometry? Why in structures destined to crumble? What kind of mind thinks not in words or myths, but in recurrence, in ratios, in time-resistant truths? What if they weren't building for gods, but for us? And if math is truly universal, if numbers are the one language that survives translation, misinterpretation, erasure, then what happens when we finally start listening? What if these ruins are not the remains of forgotten cities? What if they are the proof? In the autumn of 1769, a minor academic delivered a lecture to an empty hall. No applause, no publication, just chalk lines vanishing into a smudged slate, and a theory so misplaced that even his peers chose silence over ridicule. He spoke of ruins not as relics but as encoded systems. He claimed that buried beneath myth and symbol lay ratios that obeyed no cultural logic, only mathematical necessity. A silent grammar carved in stone that described the motions of planets, the resonances of orbits, the intervals of light. He was trained as a cartographer, but spent his nights redrawing cathedral layouts by candlelight, comparing them to Sumerian ziggurats, then to the temple complexes of South India. No one asked him to do this. He was compelled. His annotations were obsessive, sometimes illegible, numbers scrawled in margins, angular corrections etched through layers of earlier draft. What he saw were alignments, not in story but in structure. The distances between spires mimicked orbital resonances. The dimensions of ceremonial enclosures echoed lunar nodal cycles. He submitted a manuscript to the Royal Society. 84 pages. The title alone caused discomfort. A mathematical corollary to the sacred design of antiquity. One reviewer returned it unread. Another left a single word in the margin: mysticism. He did not protest. He simply kept writing. In his private journal, unpublished, never translated, he wrote of a recurring form he called the second ratio. He believed it to be older than writing, older than language, a proportional relationship that recurred in both the microcosm of sacred enclosures and the macrocosm of celestial mechanic. He was certain it had not emerged by chance. He believed it had been taught, once and then forgotten. His downfall was a single sentence spoken in front of the wrong man. At a dinner for minor philosophers and naturalists, he remarked that some temples might have been designed to store equations. Not ideas, not myth, equations. The laughter was loud. He was not invited again. In the years that followed, his name vanished from lectures, footnotes, minutes. His death was noted only as natural causes, no heirs. His papers, those not burned, were catalogued under theological misinterpretation. One set of diagrams was filed with astronomical hoaxes. Another ended up inside a museum's drawer marked Esoterica, unverified. But his drawings survived. One copy of the manuscript, printed without license, bound in fading leather, surfaced in a monastery archive in Portugal. The ink had bled. The pages smelled of damp and ash. But the geometry was intact. Ratios drawn with a compass, notes written in a code he invented himself. Circles intersecting at angles matching orbital inclinations. A sequence of points that, when plotted correctly, mapped to the eccentricity curve of Earth's rotation. None of this was recognized at the time. It would take 2 more centuries for his work to reappear in the margins of a doctoral thesis, cited not for its merit, but as an example of pre-scientific numerology. Dismissed again. Not refuted, ignored. But what if he was right? What if the buildings weren't symbols, but storage? What if the alignments weren't faith? They were memory. What does it mean when the most enduring structures in human history conform to equations not discovered until long after their stones had been laid? And what kind of mind encodes knowledge for descendants they will never meet, in a language that cannot rot, cannot burn, cannot be spoken, only measured? If that's not intent, what is? In the dry plateau country near the Sahel, a crumbling stairway leads nowhere. The ruin is unguarded, half swallowed by grass, its stone too coarse for ornament, too damaged for tourism. No plaque, no preservation. Just age without audience. It was considered ceremonial, though no one remembered the ritual. Its steps rise irregularly, worn smooth in places, sheared in others. A monument to erosion, until someone began counting. It started with the lower risers. Not symmetrical. Not evenly spaced. Just different enough to be dismissed. But he counted again. 9, 11, 13, 17. Gaps between each. Rising without repetition, each interval a prime. He didn't react. Not at first. Patterns mislead. Coincidence flatters perception. He ran measurements through a sorting program, one used to identify sequencing anomalies in cryptographic analysis. The steps held. 5 primes in a row, spaced with such control they fell within a margin of error too tight to be natural and too exact to be random. He mapped their position onto a plane, overlaid a harmonic grid, and shifted the reference frame until the noise cleared. Each prime aligned with a node, each node tied to a frequency associated not with architecture, but with sound. He remembered something obscure. A study on Mesopotamian harps, uncovered in royal graves, hollow wood sealed with pitch, strung with gut. The paper had been archived decades ago, dismissed for lack of a tuning system. He retrieved the diagrams. The string links formed ratios, odd ones. Ratios that only made sense when converted to logarithmic values. He ran them again. The sequence matched the intervals between the step. Not close. Identical. He stared at the data in silence. It was not music. It was not stairs. It was something in between, information neither spoken nor played, but constructed into the bones of two cultures separated by oceans and millennia. Different functions, same structure. He searched for more. The great enclosure at Great Zimbabwe, where wall segments terminate at angles matching the zero crossings of a known wave function. The inner sanctum of Karnak, where the floor tile spacing recreates a Fourier series. The inner diameter of an Olmec basalt ring, reduced, aligns with the square root of 2, divided by phi, multiplied by a non-integer constant used in modern signal compression. Each one unrelated. Each one dismissed. But each one constructed in a way that served no ceremonial need, no practical purpose. Ratios that mean nothing unless you're measuring something that no one else thinks is there. He pulled papers from linguistics, fractal geometry, archaeoacoustic. In isolation, they argued over symbols, origins, culture. None had looked at structure as code. None had asked whether information might be stored in mass, shape, distance. He wasn't chasing ruins anymore. He was tracing recurrence. The further he reached, the less unique the stairway became. The pattern began to surface in the unlikeliest places, in the axial layout of a half-collapsed stupa, in the distribution of holes across a bone flute dated 25,000 years, in the radial symmetry of temple grounds where no alignment should exist. It was like pulling on something that was never supposed to come loose. And each time he thought he'd hit the limit of coincidence, another sight whispered the same logic. Not in words, not in faith, but in precision. How many cultures does it take before a coincidence stops being coincidence? What is the number beyond which dismissal becomes a form of denial? He started cataloging, not to convince anyone but to keep from forgetting. Because this wasn't interpretation. It was calibration. A scattered map across epochs, each site a fixed point in a language without letters. He knew he hadn't discovered it. He'd recognized it. And that's what terrified him most. Across 3 continents, beneath centuries of dust and dismissal, the same proportion emerges. Not similar. Not reminiscent. Identical. Notation aside, culture aside, belief aside, what's left is form. And the form obeys. At Teotihuacan, the avenue of the dead stretches with proportions no one questioned. It was thought symbolic. A mirror of the heavens. A procession route. But laid out to scale, the placements of the temples along that corridor echo the Fibonacci sequence to 5 orders. Not through decoration. Through distance. The ratios of separation between structures, the nested scales between platforms, converge toward the golden ratio, not in ornament but in footprint. The math lives in what you walk over, not what you see. On Easter Island, statues face inland. That's the story often told. Guardians. Ancestors. Memory in stone. But no one bothered to test their spacing. When plotted with corrected erosion allowances, their base-to-base intervals align to a spacing grid derived from the square root of 2, an irrational number that cannot be expressed as a fraction, a constant that appears in quantum boundary conditions. The same spacing is used in modern circuit boards to avoid interference. These statues weren't placed for symmetry. They were placed for interference cancellation. They were calibrated. Thousands of miles away, at Angkor Wat, the inner sanctum reveals something even more disconcerting. Not in what it contains, but in what it avoids. The empty space surrounding the central tower has always felt excessive. Dead space, ritual space, space for pilgrims who never filled it. But measured precisely, the ratio between the inner enclosure and the sanctuary it holds maps to a non-repeating irrational constant first discovered in theoretical models of gravitational lensing. It's not an architectural decision. It's a constraint, a value that resists simplification, that cannot be expressed cleanly in human terms. A number that shouldn't be there, because it wasn't known to be real. There is no aesthetic requirement that demands irrational numbers. No religious doctrine that prescribes the square root of 2. No myth that prefers a Fibonacci spiral over an equilateral triangle. These choices are not expressive. They are functional. They suggest calculation. They demand precision. This isn't design by feeling. It's design under restriction. As if every site was answering a problem statement, one that's never been found, only its solutions. You don't build temples by accident with ratios that describe waveforms. You don't place statues over wind-beaten cliffs in a sequence that cancels harmonic distortion. You don't align city grids to the same recursive pattern that governs biological growth unless you're working from rules. What rules? Whose rules? There is no record of consultation, no evidence of communication, no trade network broad enough to explain this kind of alignment. These builders had no shared language, no shared gods, no shared calendar. But they left behind the same equations, etched in limestone, balanced in pillars, buried beneath millennia of misinterpretation. Even if every individual site is explained away as coincidence, what do we call it when they repeat across cultures that never met, across oceans they never crossed, across centuries that never touched? That is not trend. That is not diffusion. That is convergence under pressure. They were solving for something. Not myth. Not beauty. A problem. And whatever it was, it mattered more than time, more than place, more than civilization. Because long after the cultures fell silent, the numbers remain. It began with a ratio that refused to behave. At first, it showed up in an aerial survey of a ruined causeway, buried beneath volcanic ash. The measurement wasn't even the focus. It emerged in a side calculation, a ratio between two intersecting sidelines, cut by erosion, preserved by accident. The number didn't match any known architectural principle. Not pi. Not phi. Not root 2. It was longer, less elegant, impossible to round. An irrational number without a name. Nothing sacred. Nothing famous. Just 13 decimal places that held their shape across sites with no shared origin. It surfaced again, carved into the depth spacing of stone lintels from a desert necropolis. Not as symbols, as voids. Negative space carved into absence. Each gap measured precisely. The constant returned. Again. Unchanged. He cross-checked it against known constants. It belonged to none of them. It didn't describe a circle. It didn't solve a square. It had no place in the geometry of ancient belief. But when entered into a structural analysis model, one used in materials science to simulate stress distribution, it did something else. It minimized energy. Not just in theory. In practice, when the constant was applied to load-bearing intervals in primitive stone constructions, simulations showed a measurable drop in torsional stress. In arches, it yielded symmetry with minimal stone volume. In angled beams, it equalized compression without centerline fracture. Without machines. Without steel. Without calculus. A principle of effort reduction hidden in structures thought to be ceremonial. He didn't believe it. He reran the test. Different software. Different load assumptions. Same result. The number, wherever it was used, made structures last longer. Not through brute strength, but through efficiency. A principle later formalized in physics as the least action path, the route nature itself favors when left undisturbed. This number had no history, no theory, no role in mathematics until he began to notice it had been used. Not proposed. Used. Built into the walls of fortresses with no known engineers. Hidden in the intervals of terraces on monsoon-swept mountains. Etched not in symbols, but in relationships, between lengths, between volumes, between planes that survived collapse. It was not derived. It was applied. He scoured the literature. No record. No acknowledgement. No notation. Not even in the footnotes of fringe theorists or dismissed archaeologists. A number that offered mechanical advantage, but had vanished from history. Not lost, ignored. He reconstructed a partial equation using only the constant and what it minimized. What emerged was not a formula, but a design principle. One that had no aesthetic priority. Only endurance. The number favored balance. Not symmetry balance. It allowed asymmetry without failure. It permitted distortion without collapse. It preserved integrity, not shape. That's why it had gone unnoticed. Because beauty had nothing to do with it. This was not the work of artists or mystics. This was someone building for permanence. Someone who understood material fatigue, wind erosion, seismic pressure. Someone who knew what would last, and how to make it last without drawing attention. The number kept appearing in sites that were still standing. Not the ones admired for grandeur, but the ones ignored for being too utilitarian. Retaining walls that had not shifted. Foundations that had never sunk. Columns that held not because they were reinforced, but because they were angled just enough to transfer weight without strain. It wasn't just a number. It was knowledge. But there were no texts, no diagrams, no records. Only ruins. Each one a surviving line in a language no longer spoken. Each one repeating the same value for no declared reason. A constant that doesn't decorate. A constant that doesn't signify. A constant that doesn't belong, unless it was put there for those who could recognize it centuries too late. He began seeing it where no one else had thought to look, not in the ruins themselves, but in the space between them. The orientation of walls. The slope of a stair. The number of steps, not as decoration or rite, but as magnitude. Function curves hidden inside floor plans. Parabolas masquerading as corridors. Each element behaving less like a monument and more like notation. The carvings had always been misread. Spirals etched in basalt. Incisions thought to represent seasons, life, fertility. The stories folded over themselves, each new interpretation burying the last. Until someone measured. Not symbolically. Mathematically. The curvature followed a function. Logarithmic. Repeatable. Expressible in code. The spacing wasn't artistic flourish. It was scalar compression. Like a graph shrunk to fit a stone's face. In stepped pyramids, the pattern returned. Each level reduced not by whim, but by ratio. A constant descent, like a geometric sequence collapsed into physical structure. No texts accompanied them. No inscriptions at the summit. Just volume, height reduction. A pattern replicable on paper. A function cast into form. He cross-referenced with early writing systems. Quipu, the knotted strings of Andean record-keeping, where length and position carried meaning independent of symbol. The Babylonian tablets, where number preceded phoneme, where counting came before language. Early logograms didn't describe thought. They preserved process. What if these structures were not representations of belief, but records of calculation? Not allegory. Instruction. He traced alignments across sites. Angles that matched celestial transitions. Lines drawn between foundations, oriented not by worship, but by measurement. You could model them. You could graph their endpoints. The results weren't pictures. They were equations. Trigonometric identities carved into land. He tested the theory using simulation. Treat the layout of one site as input. Translate angles to values. Map distances as units. The output was not gibberish. It formed coherent expressions. Quadratic symmetries. Ratios that minimized area. Constants known only from modern optimization. The implications were harder to ignore. The builders weren't commemorating events. They weren't honoring myth. They were documenting functions. The layout wasn't to impress the eye. It was to preserve a result. The stones held shape and through shape value. Like a page meant not to be read, but reconstructed. He tested the carvings again. Adjusted for erosion. Corrected scale. The same irrational constant returned. Not only as ratio, but as curve. A shape repeating across continents, across empires that left no records in common, no shared gods, no agreed measure of time. Yet somehow the same function returned. A geometry with no homeland. This was no coincidence of style. It was language without language. Not speech. Encoding. He built a model. Each carved segment became a unit. Each segment mapped to a value. It produced a framework, a symbolic geometry hybrid, not capable of expressing emotion or narrative, but equipped for transmitting mathematical truths. Without error, without translation, a structure immune to language loss, like prime numbers used in signal encoding, like checksum sequences hidden in digital files. Only this one was made from stone, distributed, fractured, worn, yet recoverable. It hadn't been written to be admired. It had been placed to be solved. And for centuries, no one had noticed it was even a message. It was catalogued without a name. No title, no known author, no royal seal. Just a stitched binding of rotted leather and a parchment odor that betrayed centuries without air. It had been shelved deep within a Jesuit archive, misfiled among celestial atlases from the 16th century. A scholar looking for planetary diagrams opened it by accident. What he found didn't describe stars. It didn't name angels. It didn't quote scripture. The diagrams were geometric. Circles intercut by sloping lines. Grids layered atop parabolas. Ratios scrawled without labels. No script explained them. No legend told their purpose. But their structure was precise, more so than anything written in the margins beside them. At first glance they seemed ornamental, until one chart, half erased by damp, was rotated and compared with a glyph taken from a Mesoamerican codex burned in a colonial fire centuries before. The match was unambiguous, the proportions identical, the nested arcs aligned to the same ratios. Cultures separated by oceans had produced the same diagram. Not close, exact. The margins held something else. Arabic. Faded but legible. Written by a scribe who hadn't drawn the diagrams, only copied them. He refers to them not as drawings but as remnants. He calls the original source not of the learned, nor of the prophets, but of those whose knowledge preceded the fall of names. In another note, he warns, "This is not the work of man. These shapes speak what no man ought to know." Further down, his hand changes. The writing becomes hesitant. Words are struck through. He begins to equate the diagrams with forbidden operations, numerical patterns considered dangerous, not for their content, but for what they unlock. The manuscript had been reviewed once before. A marginal stamp, written in Latin, labels it Artem Daemonica, the arithmetic of demons. That label guaranteed what followed. The volume was sealed. Not destroyed. Hidden. Because burning is irreversible. But hiding grants control. The Church's reasoning wasn't mystical. It was administrative. Any system of symbols capable of producing reliable outcomes without priestly intercession was considered sorcery. Geometry was not the problem. Precision was. The fear wasn't that it contradicted faith, it bypassed it. The diagrams weren't prophecy. They were process. A repeatable system that worked regardless of language, dogma, belief. A way of encoding information not through speech but through structure. To those who held monopoly on knowledge, that was unacceptable. It was easier to label the manuscript dangerous than admit it implied continuity. A transmission of knowledge older than scripture. Older than alphabets. A sequence of values that required no revelation, no myth, no origin story, only attention. The man who uncovered it was denied access to the archive shortly after submitting a translation. The official record states that his transcript was incomplete, unverified, and potentially contaminated by forgery. No effort was made to verify. No rebuttal issued. Just absence. What matters is what remains. The diagrams have since been scanned. Not by institutions. By individuals. Scholars working outside credential. Engineers with no affiliation. Mathematicians who see the ratios and recognize not heresy, but efficiency. The same constant from the stone structures returns here. Encoded long before it should have been known. Plotted with accuracy that requires no tools but assumes understanding. This manuscript is not proof of sorcery. It is proof of suppression. Not because the knowledge was false, but because it refused to die. The ruins have no names for themselves. No inscriptions to tell you what they believed, who they buried, or which god they feared. There are no stories painted on their walls, no hieroglyph, no oral tradition reaching forward through time. Only ratios, only alignments, only stone laid in silence, and numbers that reappear where they should not. We assume mythology comes first. That belief precedes structure. That temples are raised to honor stories already told. But what if the sequence is wrong? What if the stories came later? What if the first builders had no myths to pass down, only knowledge they could not speak, but refused to let disappear? Look at what they left. Design principles that match across civilizations with no contact, no common ancestry. Precision that ignores the limits of local materials. Forms that emerge again and again with no symbolic decoration, only mathematical purpose. You do not get shared design without a shared template. You do not get matching constants without transmission. But there is no trade, no conquest, no migration to explain it. Only structures, standing apart, repeating the same decisions. Not one of them carries an origin myth. No flood, no sky god, no golden age. They do not explain where they came from. They do not explain themselves at all. As if they did not need to. As if explanation was never the point. They do not tell stories. They demonstrate outcomes. Each ratio is a conclusion. Each alignment a solution. Each elevation a calculation frozen in stone. This was not culture. Culture decays. Culture forgets. This was something else. The constants recur because they are not inventions. They are discoveries. The builders did not imagine them. They found them, buried not in soil, but in the nature of structure itself. They found what works, what lasts, what preserves balance across time. We have called them primitive. We have assumed they built by trial, by guesswork, by tradition. But guesswork does not encode irrational numbers. Tradition does not produce alignment with orbital mechanics. There is intent here, and that intent did not come from story, it came from recognition. Recognition of rules. We write our knowledge in books, in language, in code that requires instruction to decode. They did not. They carved theirs into the ratios of walls, into the tilt of surfaces, into the spaces between things. Because language can vanish, belief can fracture. But a measurement left untouched will be the same when found. No scroll survives 12,000 years. But a stone aligned with precision can outlast memory. What kind of civilization builds not to be seen, but to be rediscovered? Not to impress, but to instruct? Not to glorify itself, but to leave behind something that cannot be misunderstood by time? No culture survives that long. But knowledge might, if it were placed carefully enough, quietly enough, repeated often enough to make forgetting impossible. Even if no one realized they were remembering. We have been walking through a library we never knew was written. We called it ruin. It may have been warning. You can calculate the odds. Take a single irrational constant. Plot its recurrence in structures separated by geography, culture, chronology. Assign probabilities to each instance. Factor in erosion, collapse, looting, reconstruction. Account for human error. Account for measurement tolerance. Run the models forward 5,000 years. Then backward to origin. Repeat until the data stabilizes. What emerges is not noise. Not drift. Not randomness concealed by clever pattern matching. What emerges is structure. Surviving structure. Across time frames where languages disintegrate and belief systems fracture, these numbers remain. Not because they were popular. Not because they were intuitive. Because they were placed where destruction would be slowest. Into foundations. Into slopes that resist water. Into lines too wide to erase and too subtle to notice. The pattern survives not because it was protected, but because it was built to resist forgetting without being remembered. This is not probability. This is intention masquerading as inevitability. Simulations show it clearly. Seed a constant across early site. Ensure no single location contains all of it. Encode only fragments. Allow centuries to pass. Civilizations rise. Cultures change. Wars erase lineage. Natural disaster reshapes terrain. But the fragments remain. Alone, each looks meaningless. Together, reconstructed, they resolve. Like points along a broken curve that still defines the shape it once was. The same constants appear in temples no longer used. In altars no longer understood. In walls dismissed as ceremonial. You can strip away the religion, the myth, the purpose. What's left still computes. What's left still conforms. Remove coincidence from the model. Replace it with design. Ask what kind of design survives through loss. The result begins to resemble not a monument, but a message. Not in words, in ratios, because ratios do not need translation. They only need precision. Ask what kind of mind chooses to encode knowledge this way. Not in books, not in speech, in form. Ask why. These ruins do not preserve empires. They do not remember kings. They remember values. They carry no names. They name no events. They mark no victories. They preserve constants that offer no narrative reward. No drama. No mythic resonance. Only functions. Only calculations that no known ancient civilization should have known, much less applied. That is not how empires preserve themselves. That is how systems transmit. Not once. Across generations that never knew they were relaying anything at all. If you wanted to build a transmission system that could survive the collapse of every culture it touched, you would not make it obvious. You would not make it sacred. You would make it repeatable, quiet, durable. You would not write a message. You would scatter the code across stone and space, in pieces so small no one would think to read them together. And you would wait. Not for understanding. For recognition. What if we have not been digging up history? What if we have been uncovering instructions? It begins where it started. The first sight. The one everyone passed without hesitation. Nothing about it demanded reverence. No grandeur. No known god. A ring of upright stones, cut without flourish, aligned to no solstice, inscribed with no names. Just a pattern carved into the interior faces. A pattern thought to be decorative. Repeating triangles, layered in shrinking scales. Too regular to be random. Too plain to be important. He had walked past it dozens of times. Measured it once. Filed it as a curiosity. But curiosity wears down. Until he saw it again. Not in stone, but on a terminal. Not in form, but in code. He had been running simulations. Cultural transmission rates over time. He wanted to know how knowledge failed. What broke first? Language? Ritual? Purpose? He modeled it through recursive decay, each generation losing a portion of what it inherited, each loss multiplying by context, by conflict, by silence. The curve that emerged was sharp. Too sharp. Civilizations forgot faster than they should. As if some principle drove it. Not a mistake. A law. He recognized it. Not the shape. The ratio. It matched the angles carved into the stone ring. The triangles. Their contraction followed the same reduction curve as his model of cultural decay. Each triangle's base shrank by the same ratio his simulation predicted for generational loss of unrecorded knowledge. He measured again. The angles weren't just proportional. They were exact. So were the distances. Each layer encoded a value. Each value mapped to an equation. A recursive function that could not be known unless you had already simulated the process of forgetting. Not learning. Forgetting. It wasn't decoration. It was acknowledgement. Whoever carved it had already seen the decline. Not as tragedy. As certainty. The pattern wasn't a warning. It was a model. A blueprint for loss. Not of monuments. Of meaning. Not of buildings. Of memory. He ran the numbers again. Substituted the recursive function from the stone into the simulation. The output matched reality. Not perfectly, but close enough to leave no room for coincidence. They knew. They knew we would not preserve knowledge. That we would ritualize what we couldn't understand, worship what we couldn't decode, and forget what we could not interpret. They knew we would bury what we didn't recognize, not in the ground but in repetition, in reconstruction, in blind imitation of shapes whose meaning had already faded. This wasn't the remnant of a lost civilization. It was the residue of a transmission. We didn't lose it. We absorbed it. We repeated it. We carved it again and again without knowing why. We built upon its remains while naming our own foundations. We turned messages into symbols, symbols into myth, myths into ruins. We inherited it, and then forgot what it meant. Thank you for watching and sticking with me to the end. Now, if you believe humanity deserves a future among the stars, do subscribe now. Only those who'd abandon Earth to its fate will scroll past.